A wooden god carved 11,600 years ago, preserved by a chemical accident that modern science can barely explain. A tiny Roman face, barely an inch tall, found sealed inside an Aztec grave 1,000 years before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing west. Microscopic metal spirals made of tungsten and molybdenum, elements we only learned to work with in the 20th century, pulled from sediment layers that some researchers claim date to 300,000 years ago, though this extraordinary claim remains unverified by mainstream science. Tonight we are going to walk through 10 of the most unsettling archaeological discoveries ever made. These are not legends. These are not theories whispered in obscure corners of the internet. These are objects that have been tested, measured, examined by laboratories in Moscow, Heidelberg, St. Petersburg, and institutions around the world. They sit in museums. They have been photographed, X-rayed, carbon dated. And yet, every single one of them refuses to fit neatly into the story we have been taught about human history. If you believe that civilization began roughly 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, that ancient humans were simple, primitive, incapable of complex thought or sophisticated technology, then what you are about to hear will force you to reconsider everything. These discoveries are not anomalies to be explained away. They are cracks in the foundation of our understanding, and the deeper we look, the wider those cracks become. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Tap that like button if you are ready to have your perception of history challenged. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. And stay until the very end, because the final discovery on this list is perhaps the strangest of all. An object so impossible that it has remained almost completely unstudied. Not because scientists lack interest, but because it may simply be unverifiable. As always with these journeys, the visuals are here to add context, but they are not necessary to follow along. Whether you are watching closely, listening while you work, or settling in for a night of mysteries, get comfortable. Let the outside world fade away. What you are about to learn may forever change the way you think about the past. Let us begin. The Shigir idol. In the frozen heart of the Ural Mountains, about 100 kilometers from the Russian city of Yekaterinburg, there exists a peat bog that has guarded a secret for over 11,000 years. To understand what we found there, you first need to understand why this discovery should not exist at all. Wood decays. This is one of the fundamental truths of biology. When a tree falls in a forest, an army of invisible organisms immediately goes to work. Bacteria break down the cellulose. Fungi consume the lignin. Insects burrow through the fibers. In a temperate forest, a fallen tree might last a few decades before crumbling into soil. In tropical environments, decomposition happens even faster, sometimes within just a few years. This is why archaeology has traditionally focused on stone, bone, and metal. These materials survive, wood vanishes, except in places where biology's rules do not apply. Peat bogs create something close to a time capsule. The water is acidic, the environment is oxygen deprived, and the natural tanning agents in the bog preserve organic material in ways that would be impossible anywhere else. Bodies have been pulled from these bogs looking as though they died weeks ago, only to be dated at thousands of years old. And in 1890, at the Shigir peat bog, gold prospectors digging through the waterlogged earth pulled up something that would eventually shatter everything we thought we knew about prehistoric art. They found fragments of carved wood, 10 pieces in total covered in strange geometric patterns, and what appeared to be human faces. At first, no one understood what they had found. The pieces were taken to a museum in Yekaterinburg, where they were reassembled into a towering figure. The original reconstruction stood at 2.8 meters tall, but later analysis of drawings made at the time of discovery suggested the complete sculpture may have originally reached 5.3 meters in height. That is roughly the height of a two-story building, carved from a single larch tree trunk. For decades, the Shigir idol, as it came to be known, sat in relative obscurity. Experts initially dated it to somewhere around 9,000 years old, already an astonishing age that made it older than Stonehenge by more than 4,000 years. But in 2014, German researchers from the Lower Saxony State Office for Cultural Heritage began a new series of tests using accelerator mass spectrometry, a far more precise method of radiocarbon dating. What they found stunned the archaeological world. The wood itself dates to approximately 11,500 to 12,100 years ago. Accounting for the fact that the sample came from the heart of the tree, which would have been dead long before the outer rings, researchers now estimate that the sculpture was carved around 100 BCE. This makes the Shigir idol more than twice as old as the Great Pyramids of Egypt. It predates every monumental structure we know of, and it was created by people we have always been told were simple hunter-gatherers, wandering the frozen tundra with stone tools, incapable of anything beyond basic survival. But look at what they created. The idol is covered with complex geometric patterns, zigzags, chevrons, diagonal lines carved in deliberate sequences. 7 distinct faces have been identified on the sculpture, stacked vertically along its length. Their features are abstract but unmistakably human, with wide, hollow eyes that seem to stare out across the millennia. The marks were made with 3 different sizes of chisels, crafted from the jawbones of beavers, whose sharp incisor teeth provided natural carving edges. This was not random scratching on a piece of wood. This was planned, intentional, symbolic art. What does it mean? Svetlana Savchenko, a leading researcher at the Sverdlovsk Regional Museum, believes the carvings tell a creation story, a coded narrative of how these ancient people understood the origin of the world. Other researchers have suggested the patterns might represent a map or navigational aid, the straight lines and arrows indicating travel routes across the landscape. Mikhail Zhilin, an archaeologist at the Russian Academy of Sciences, has proposed that the faces might depict forest spirits or protective deities. The truth is, we do not know, and we may never know, because the Shigir idol forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. For 90% of human history, wood was probably our primary creative material. It is abundant, easy to work, and infinitely versatile. But almost none of it survives. The Shigir idol exists only because of a freakish chemical accident in a Siberian peat bog. How many other masterpieces have rotted into nothingness? How many civilizations expressed their greatest thoughts in a medium that simply melted back into the earth? We have built our entire understanding of human prehistory on stone because stone is what survives, but the Shigir idol whispers to us that we might be missing most of the story. There is something else about the Shigir idol that rarely gets discussed, and it concerns the state of scientific resistance that initially greeted its dating. When the first radiocarbon tests were conducted in the 1990s, suggesting an age of approximately 9,500 years, many scholars simply refused to accept the results. The objection was not scientific but conceptual. Hunter-gatherers living in the Mesolithic period were not supposed to be capable of creating such sophisticated symbolic art. The prevailing theory held that complex ritualistic expression only emerged with the development of sedentary farming communities, particularly in the Fertile Crescent. A massive carved idol from the frozen Russian wilderness upended this assumption so completely that the initial reaction was denial. It took German researchers conducting more rigorous accelerator mass spectrometry testing in 2014 to confirm and indeed extend the earlier dates. Even then, the implications were not immediately absorbed. Academic papers continued to describe early Mesolithic cultures as simple bands of hunters following animal migrations, crafting only the most basic tools for survival. The Shigir idol existed as an anomaly that textbooks quietly ignored. But consider what its creation implies about the society that produced it. Carving a 5-meter sculpture from a single larch trunk requires planning. Someone had to select an appropriate tree, one of sufficient size and quality. Someone had to fell it using stone tools, a process that would take days of concerted effort. The trunk had to be transported to a location where it could be worked, likely near water for the steam and soaking that would have made the wood more pliable. Then the actual carving began, requiring not just skill but a pre-existing design. A mental image of what the finished object should look like. This is not spontaneous expression. This is organised labour guided by shared cultural purpose. The geometric patterns on the idol follow repeating sequences, suggesting a codified symbolic language. The 7 faces are positioned deliberately along the sculpture's length, perhaps representing different deities, ancestors, or aspects of a single divine being. The use of beaver jaw tools indicates specialised knowledge of which animals could provide appropriate implements. We are looking at the work of a complex society with developed traditions, shared beliefs, and the surplus resources necessary to dedicate significant time and effort to non-survival activities. These are not people scratching out bare existence on the edge of starvation. These are people with culture. The Shigir bog has not been fully explored. Funding limitations and the remote location have prevented comprehensive excavation. Other artifacts have been found, including a decorated antler dated to the same period, suggesting that the idol was not an isolated creation but part of a broader artistic tradition. What else might be waiting in the waterlogged depths? The Ain Ghazal statues. 9,000 years ago, in what is now the outskirts of Amman, Jordan, a community lived in one of the largest settlements on Earth. At its peak, around 7000 BCE, the town we call Ain Ghazal housed approximately 3,000 people and covered between 10 and 15 hectares. They grew barley, wheat, chickpeas and lentils. They had domesticated goats. They built rectangular houses with stone walls, timber roof beams, and floors coated in lime plaster painted with red pigment. They buried their dead beneath those floors, and sometimes they did something extraordinary with the skulls. They removed them. They covered them in plaster. They gave them faces. And then, sometime around 7000 BCE, they created something that still haunts everyone who sees it today. In 1983, archaeologists led by Gary Rollofson were examining a cross-section of soil that had been exposed by a bulldozer during construction of a highway. At a depth of about 2.5 metres, they noticed the edge of a large pit. What they uncovered over the next 2 years would become one of the most important discoveries in the study of Neolithic culture. 2 caches of plaster statues buried about 200 years apart, containing a total of 15 full figures and 15 busts. Some stood over 1 metre tall. All were made from lime plaster moulded over frameworks of bundled reeds. Their bodies were flat and stylised, but their faces were something else entirely. Large almond-shaped eyes outlined in black bitumen, upturned noses with prominent nostrils, mouths set in expressions that seemed to hover somewhere between serenity and unsettling intensity. To look at the Ain Ghazal statues is to feel that you are being looked at in return. The technical achievement here is remarkable enough. Creating lime plaster requires heating limestone to temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius, which transforms calcium carbonate into calcium oxide. When water is added, it becomes calcium hydroxide, a mouldable paste that hardens into a durable surface as it absorbs carbon dioxide from the air. This is essentially the same chemistry behind modern cement. The people of Ain Ghazal had developed what amounts to an early form of industrial chemical engineering 9,000 years ago, 3,000 years before the pyramids were built. But the statues raise questions that go far deeper than chemistry. Why were they made? Why were they buried? Why do some have 2 heads joined at the back staring in opposite directions, like some kind of Janus figure from mythology? The most widely accepted theory is that they represent ancestors, venerated dead whose spirits remained connected to the living community. This interpretation is supported by the similar treatment given to human skulls at the site, which were also removed from bodies, covered in plaster, and given moulded facial features. The statues may have been displayed for a time, perhaps dressed in clothing, perhaps mounted on platforms or altars, before being ritually destroyed and buried when their spiritual power was exhausted, or when new statues were created to replace them. But here is what disturbs me most about Ain Ghazal. Beginning around 6500 BCE, after more than 2,000 years of continuous occupation, the settlement began a dramatic decline. The population, which had peaked at around 3,000, dropped to roughly 1/6 of that number. The sophisticated plaster technology was gradually abandoned. The site continued to be occupied until approximately 5000 BCE, but never again reached its former heights. This remarkable culture faded from the archaeological record over the course of 1500 years. What happened? Some researchers believe they exhausted their environment. The constant demand for fuel to heat limestone may have led to deforestation. Overgrazing by domesticated goats may have degraded the landscape. Climate shifts may have reduced rainfall. Or perhaps there was disease, conflict, or social collapse that we cannot detect from the material remains. Whatever the cause, Ain Ghazal serves as a sobering reminder. Civilizations can develop extraordinary technologies and then lose them. Progress is not inevitable. Societies can reach heights of sophistication and then fall back into darkness, leaving only fragments for future generations to puzzle over. The people who created those haunting statues with their bitumen eyes possessed knowledge that their descendants did not inherit. How many other heights did our ancestors reach that we know nothing about? The chemistry of lime plaster production deserves closer examination because it reveals just how sophisticated the Ain Ghazal people were. Limestone is calcium carbonate. When heated to temperatures above 800 degrees Celsius, it undergoes calcination, releasing carbon dioxide and transforming into calcium oxide, commonly called quicklite. When water is added to quicklime, an exothermic reaction occurs, generating significant heat and producing calcium hydroxide or slaked lime. This paste can be moulded and shaped. As it dries and absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it gradually reconverts to calcium carbonate, hardening into a durable material. To achieve the necessary temperatures for calcination, the people of Ain Ghazal would have needed to construct and maintain kilns capable of sustained high heat. This requires understanding of combustion, airflow, fuel selection, and thermal dynamics. The fuel alone, likely wood have been consumed in enormous quantities. Maintaining production at the scale evident at Ain Ghazal, where plaster covered floors, walls, and was used for skull decoration and statue creation, implies organised labour, resource management, and accumulated technical knowledge passed between generations. This is not accidental discovery. This is engineering. The statues themselves show evidence of careful construction methodology. Reed frameworks provided internal support, allowing the plaster to be built up in layers around an armature. The proportions are consistent across multiple figures, suggesting the use of templates or the measurement standards. The application of bitumen for the eyes required access to natural petroleum seeps and knowledge of how to work this material. When we look at the Ain Ghazal statues, we are not seeing primitive attempts at human representation. We are seeing the products of a mature artistic tradition with standardized techniques and aesthetic conventions. The question is not whether these people were sophisticated. The evidence proves they were. The question is what else they might have created that did not survive, and why their knowledge was not preserved. The decline of Ain Ghazal beginning around 6500 BCE correlates with broader patterns of settlement stress across the Levant during this period. Climate data suggests a shift toward drier conditions that would have stressed agricultural communities dependent on predictable rainfall. But environmental pressure alone does not explain the loss of technical knowledge. Lime plaster technology did eventually reappear in later cultures, but centuries passed between the decline of Ain Ghazal and its redevelopment elsewhere. This gap represents lost generations. People who knew how to build kilns, how to process limestone, how to create plaster statues with bitumen eyes, they died without passing on what they knew. Their children and grandchildren may have remembered stories of the old ways, but the practical skills were gone. How much of our own knowledge is similarly vulnerable? The Baghdad Battery. In 1936, during construction of a railway line near the ancient city of Ctesiphon in modern-day Iraq, workers uncovered a series of graves containing artefacts that would spark a debate lasting nearly a century. Among the objects recovered was a small terracotta jar, about 14 centimetres tall, containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, all sealed together with bitumen. The discovery came to the attention of Wilhelm Koenig, who was at the time director of the laboratory at the National Museum of Iraq. Koenig had noticed something peculiar about certain ancient gold and silver objects in the museum's collection. They appeared to be plated with thin layers of metal, a technique that in the modern world requires electricity. When he examined the jar with its copper and iron components, he made a bold proposal. This was a galvanic cell. This was a battery, and it was approximately 2,000 years old. The concept is elegantly simple. Copper and iron have different electrochemical potentials. When placed in an acidic solution, such as vinegar or fermented grape juice, they generate a small electrical current. The bitumen seal would have kept the electrolyte from evaporating. The Baghdad battery, as it came to be called, could theoretically produce around 1 volt of electricity. Modern experiments have confirmed that replicas of the device do work. In 2005, the television program Mythbusters constructed 10 handmade copies and, using lemon juice as an electrolyte, demonstrated that when linked together, they could produce approximately 4 volts, enough to electroplate a small object. A 2026 study published in Synoplatonic Papers by researcher Alexander Bazes went even further, arguing that the unglazed clay jar itself may have acted as a second cell when exposed to air, potentially generating over 1.4 volts, far more than previous estimates. But here is where the controversy begins, and I must be clear about where mainstream archaeology stands. There is no ancient text that describes this device. There is no archaeological evidence of wires. There are no electroplated objects that can be definitively linked to this technology. The pottery style suggests the jar dates to the Sasanian period, somewhere between 224 and 650 CE, rather than the earlier Parthian era Koenig originally proposed. And some researchers have suggested the whole assembly might have served an entirely different purpose, perhaps as a container for sacred scrolls or as part of religious rituals. The overwhelming majority of archaeologists reject the battery hypothesis. In 2012, Professor Elizabeth Stone of Stony Brook University stated bluntly that she had never met a single archaeologist who believed the artifacts were ancient batteries. The original Baghdad battery has been lost since the looting of the Iraq Museum in 2003, making further study impossible. And yet, the questions persist. Ancient Greeks and Romans are documented to have used electric fish to treat ailments like headaches and gout, demonstrating a practical understanding of electrical effects long before the modern era. Roman goldwork has been found with plating so thin and even that it seems inconsistent with the mercury amalgam technique that would have been available at the time. Similar jar assemblages have been found at Seleucia and other sites in the region, suggesting this was not an isolated curiosity but part of a broader pattern. What if the Baghdad battery represents a technology that was developed, used for some specific purpose and then lost? What if there were ancient electrical applications that we simply cannot identify because we do not know what to look for? The device sits at the intersection of confirmed science and maddening uncertainty. We know it could work, we do not know if it ever did. The most recent research on the Baghdad battery comes from a 2026 paper published in Sino-Platonic Papers by independent researcher Alexander Bazes. His work challenges previous assumptions about the device's power output and offers a new theory about how it might have functioned. Previous experiments had focused on the inner components, the copper cylinder and iron rod immersed in an acidic electrolyte. These tests consistently produced around 0.5 to 1 volt, enough to generate a detectable current but far too weak for practical applications like electroplating. Critics argued that such low power made the battery hypothesis implausible. Bazes proposed that the unglazed clay jar itself played a critical role. When filled with an alkaline electrolyte like lye, sodium hydroxide, the porous ceramic would have acted as a separator between the interior solution and the ambient air. This configuration creates what is essentially a second electrochemical cell, with the tin solder used to seal the copper vessel serving as an additional electrode. When both the inner and outer cells are connected in series, the combined voltage could exceed 1.4 volts, more than enough for visible electrochemical reactions. This theory has not been universally accepted. Some researchers point out that there is no direct evidence of sodium hydroxide being available to ancient Mesopotamians. Others note that the original artifact was lost during the chaos following the 2003 invasion of Iraq, making any further physical analysis impossible. We are forced to work with replicas and reports rather than the actual object. But consider the broader context. The Parthian and Sasanian empires that controlled Mesopotamia during the period when the battery was likely created were not primitive societies. They were sophisticated civilizations with advanced metallurgy, astronomy, and medicine. The Parthians traded with Rome and China simultaneously, sitting at the crossroads of the ancient world. The Sasanians developed complex irrigation systems, supported philosophical academies, and produced some of the finest metalwork of the ancient world. Is it so impossible that such a civilization might have stumbled upon basic electrochemistry? The history of science is full of discoveries that were made and then lost. The Greeks knew the Earth was round and calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy. The Romans developed concrete that lasted for millennia, a formula that was lost and not rediscovered until the modern era. Chinese civilizations invented gunpowder, printing, and the compass centuries before these technologies reached Europe. Technologies do not progress in a straight line. They branch, stagnate, and sometimes disappear entirely. The Baghdad battery may represent one such branch, a line of investigation that ancient tinkerers pursued for reasons we cannot fathom and then abandoned, leaving behind only these enigmatic clay jars with their copper cylinders and iron rods. Derinkuyu. In 1963, a man in the Turkish town of Derinkuyu was renovating his home. He took a sledgehammer to a wall in his basement, expecting to find solid rock behind it. Instead, the wall crumbled away to reveal a dark passage that seemed to extend forever into the earth. He had just accidentally rediscovered one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the ancient world. The passage led to more passages. The passages led to chambers. The chambers led to entire levels of carved stone rooms extending down into the volcanic rock beneath Cappadocia. What local residents had used for centuries as simple wells for drawing water turned out to be ventilation shafts piercing through a massive underground city capable of housing 20,000 people. Derinkuyu is not unique. More than 200 underground settlements have been discovered in the Cappadocia region, carved into the soft volcanic tuff that covers this part of central Turkey. But Derinkuyu is the deepest and largest. Its tunnels extend approximately 85 metres below the surface, with 18 to 20 levels total, though only 8 are currently accessible to visitors. It contains living quarters, storage rooms, kitchens, wine and oil presses, stables for livestock, chapels, schools, and even a cruciform church on the 7th level. Massive circular stone doors weighing up to 500 kilograms each could be rolled across passages to seal off each level independently from the inside. The engineering is extraordinary. Ventilation shafts brought fresh air to the deepest levels, while simultaneously serving as wells for water. Narrow passages forced potential invaders to enter single file, making them easy targets for defenders. Dead-end corridors and labyrinthine layouts were designed to confuse and trap enemies. Multiple secret exits provided escape routes if the main entrances were compromised. Whoever built this place was thinking about defense on a scale that suggests they had very serious enemies. But who were they? And why did they need to hide underground? The historical record provides no clear answers. Some archaeologists believe the initial excavations began around 1600 BCE, during the Hittite period. Others attribute the earliest work to the Phrygians around 700 BCE. The city was certainly expanded and used extensively during the Byzantine era, from roughly the 5th to the 10th centuries CE, when Christian communities sought refuge from Arab raids. The presence of Greek inscriptions and Byzantine-style chapels supports this later use, yet the scope of the construction suggests something more than occasional refuge. You do not carve a city from solid rock that extends 85 metres underground because you are worried about raiders who might pass through once or twice a century. You do this because you expect to spend long periods of time underground. The presence of wine presses and storage facilities indicates that residents plan to be self-sufficient for months, perhaps years. One theory suggests the underground cities served as protection from extreme climate variations. Cappadocian summers are brutally hot, winters are bitterly cold. Underground, the temperature remains constant and moderate year-round. Another theory proposes that the cities provided sanctuary from some catastrophic event, perhaps volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, or even the kind of natural disasters that ancient peoples might have interpreted as divine punishment. What haunts me about Derinkuyu is not just its existence, but its forgetting. By 1923, when the Christian Greek population was expelled during the population exchange between Turkey and Greece, knowledge of the underground city had been completely lost. For 40 years, people lived directly above this massive subterranean complex without knowing it was there. If one man had not decided to renovate his basement, we might never have found it at all. What else lies hidden beneath our feet, waiting to be discovered? To truly appreciate Derinkuyu, you need to understand the geology that made it possible. Cappadocia sits on a volcanic plateau formed millions of years ago by eruptions from what are now Mount Erciyes and Mount Hassan. The lava flows deposited thick layers of volcanic ash that compressed over time into a stone called tuff. Unlike granite or limestone, tuff is relatively soft when first exposed, but hardens significantly when dried. This property makes it ideal for carving, as ancient builders could excavate rooms and passages with simple tools while the fresh stone was still pliable. The same geological forces that created the tuff also produced Cappadocia's famous fairy chimneys, tall spires of stone capped with harder basalt that resisted erosion, while the softer material around them wore away. Early inhabitants recognized that the soft rock offered natural shelter, and simple caves have been used in the region for at least 8,000 years. But Derinkuyu is not a simple cave. It is an architectural achievement that required systematic planning and coordinated labor over many generations. The ventilation system alone demonstrates sophisticated engineering. Shafts had to be positioned to draw fresh air to the lowest levels, while preventing backdrafts that could fill the city with smoke from cooking fires. The angle and diameter of these shafts were not random, they were calculated to create natural airflow patterns through convection. The deepest shafts also served as wells, tapping into underground water sources that provided fresh water even during extended sieges. The defensive features show military thinking. The narrow tunnels forced attackers into single-file formations where they could be picked off one by one. Massive rolling stone doors could seal passages in seconds, isolating intruders in sections of the city where they could be trapped or killed. False tunnels led to dead ends or ambush points. The entire layout was designed by people who expected to be attacked and who had thought carefully about how to survive. And yet, for all this preparation, Derinkuyu was eventually abandoned. The Christian Greek communities who used it during the Ottoman period were expelled in 1923, and within a few decades, the very existence of the underground city had been forgotten. The man who rediscovered it in 1963 had no idea what lay beneath his house. His neighbours drew water from wells that passed through the city's ventilation shafts without knowing they were connected to anything larger. How could something so massive be so completely forgotten? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the communities that used it. Derinkuyu was a refuge, not a home. People retreated there during times of danger and returned to the surface when the threat passed. The underground city was a place of survival, not of celebration. There may have been no songs written about it, no stories told around evening fires. It was simply there, when needed, and ignored when not. This suggests a sobering possibility. Places of refuge may be especially vulnerable to forgetting. The memories associated with them are memories of fear and hardship, not of joy and accomplishment. When the danger passes, people may prefer not to remember. What else have we forgotten because it was too painful to preserve? The Sanxingdui bronzes. In 1929, a farmer in Sichuan province was digging a drainage ditch when his shovel struck something hard. He pulled from the earth a cache of jade artifacts, unlike anything ever seen in China. Word spread slowly, and in 1934, American missionary and archaeologist David Crockett Graham led an official investigation that revealed the existence of an entire forgotten city stretching for more than 7 miles, but it would be another 50 years before the world understood what had been found. In 1986, construction workers near the town of Guanghan accidentally uncovered 2 massive sacrificial pits filled with artifacts that would force scholars to completely rewrite the history of Chinese civilization. What they pulled from those pits were bronze masks, human figures, and other objects that looked like nothing else on Earth. The masks are what capture the imagination. They are massive, some standing over a metre wide, with angular human features, protruding eyes that extend outward like tubes, enormous ears stretching toward the sky, and expressions that seem simultaneously serene and profoundly alien. The largest bronze mask ever found at the site, discovered in 2021, measures 131 centimetres wide. Separately, a gold mask weighing approximately 280 grams was also discovered. These are not portraits, they are something else entirely. The Sanxingdui culture flourished from approximately 1700 BCE to around 1050 BCE, contemporaneous with the Shang dynasty that has traditionally been considered the foundation of Chinese civilization. But the Sanxingdui people developed in complete isolation from the Shang. Their artistic styles share nothing in common. Their bronze-working techniques, while equally sophisticated, followed entirely different aesthetic principles. Where Shang bronzes are decorated with surface patterns on ritual vessels, Sanxingdui bronzes are massive 3-dimensional sculptures designed for overwhelming visual impact. Between 2020 and 2022, excavations at 6 additional sacrificial pits produced over 13,000 new artifacts, including fragments of gold masks, traces of silk, bronze figures depicting hybrid creatures that are part human and part animal, and a bronze sacred tree nearly 4 meters tall, 396 centimeters to be precise, decorated with birds, fruits, and mysterious symbols. The sheer quantity and quality of the finds defied expectations at every turn. And yet, there is no writing. Not a single inscription has been found at Sanxingdui. No oracle bones, no historical texts, no records of any kind that might tell us who these people were or what they believed. We have only the objects themselves, and those objects raise more questions than they answer. Why do the eyes protrude so dramatically? Some researchers suggest this represents a specific deity, perhaps the semi-legendary Kangkong, the first king of the Shu kingdom, who is said to have eyes that could see in multiple directions. Others propose the masks were designed to be worn by priests during rituals, the protruding eyes representing altered states of consciousness or visionary experience. Why were the artifacts burned and deliberately broken before burial? The pits show clear evidence of ritualistic destruction. Objects were smashed, set on fire, and then carefully arranged in layers mixed with elephant tusks and burnt animal bones. This was not accidental damage. This was intentional ceremonial destruction, perhaps representing the death of the object's spiritual power or the closing of a religious cycle. And why did the civilization simply disappear around 1000 BCE? Archaeological evidence suggests that the city was abandoned rather than conquered. Some researchers believe earthquakes or floods may have made the area uninhabitable. Others propose that the Sanxingdui people migrated to the nearby Jinsha site where similar artifacts have been found. But the abruptness of the disappearance and the deliberate burial of their most sacred objects suggests they knew the end was coming. Sanxingdui proves that our understanding of ancient history is built on fragments. A sophisticated civilization with its own unique artistic tradition flourished for nearly 1,000 years and then vanished, leaving behind only silent bronze faces staring out with their impossible eyes, waiting to be found. The sacrificial pits at Sanxingdui contain a mystery within a mystery, the deliberate destruction of sacred objects. When archaeologists first excavated pits 1 and 2 in 1986, they found that virtually every artifact had been damaged before burial. Bronze masks were smashed, human figures were broken, the sacred trees were cut into pieces. Many objects showed evidence of burning, with some bronzes melted into unrecognizable lumps. Mixed among the ruined artifacts were elephant tusks, burned animal bones, and what appear to be ritual deposits of grain. This was not random vandalism. This was ritualized termination, the deliberate ending of an object's spiritual life. In many ancient cultures, sacred objects were believed to accumulate power over time through repeated ritual use. But this power could become dangerous if allowed to grow unchecked, or it might become corrupted, or it might simply reach the end of its useful cycle. The solution was ceremonial destruction, breaking the object to release or neutralize its spiritual energy before disposing of the remains in a sacred location. The presence of burning is particularly significant. Fire was often associated with transformation, with the passage from one state to another. By burning the sacred objects before burial, the Sanxingdui people may have been transforming them, releasing their spiritual essence to travel to another realm while leaving only the material husk behind. But why all at once? The 6 additional pits discovered between 2020 and 2022 appear to date to approximately the same period, around 1100 to 1050 BCE. This suggests a concentrated episode of ritual destruction rather than gradual accumulation over centuries. Something happened that caused the Sanxingdui people to terminate all their sacred objects simultaneously and then abandon the city. Was it a natural disaster? Geological surveys of the region suggest that earthquakes and flooding were recurrent problems. A particularly severe earthquake might have been interpreted as divine displeasure requiring the sacrifice of all sacred objects, or the ruling class might have been overthrown, with the new rulers destroying symbols of the old regime. Was it religious transformation? Cultures sometimes undergo dramatic shifts in belief that lead to the destruction of older sacred materials. The conversion of Rome to Christianity saw the demolition of pagan temples. The Protestant Reformation sparked waves of iconoclasm. Perhaps the Sanxingdui experienced a similar revolution, or was it planned all along? Some scholars have suggested that the Sanxingdui had a cyclical religious calendar that required periodic destruction and renewal of sacred objects. The pits might represent the culmination of such a cycle, a grand closing ceremony before migration to a new sacred centre at Jinsha. We may never know. The absence of writing means we cannot access the thoughts and motivations of the people involved. We have only the physical evidence. Thousands of deliberately broken objects, burned and buried in pits, abandoned for 3,000 years until construction workers accidentally broke through. The masks continue to stare with their impossible eyes, keeping their secrets. The Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca head. In 1933, archaeologist José García Payon was excavating a burial site at Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca in the Toluca Valley, about 65 kilometers northwest of the Mexico City. The site dated to the final decades before the Spanish conquest, between approximately 1476 and 1510 CE. The burial was sealed beneath 3 intact floors of a pyramidal structure containing the typical grave goods of the period: objects made of gold, copper, turquoise, rock crystal, bone, shell and pottery, and one small terracotta head that looked nothing like anything else in Mexico. The head is approximately 1 inch tall, about 2.5 centimetres, depicting a bearded man with distinctly European features. His hairstyle and the treatment of his beard place him stylistically in the Hellenistic Roman tradition, specifically around the 2nd or 3rd century CE. Ernst Beringer, a classical archaeologist who examined the object, stated confidently that it was Roman work from approximately 200 CE. Bernard Andrea, Director Emeritus of the German Archaeological Institute in Rome, confirmed this assessment. There is just one problem. The Roman Empire and pre-Columbian Mexico are supposed to have had no contact whatsoever. The official historical narrative holds that the first Europeans to reach the American mainland were Christopher Columbus and his crew in the late 15th century. A Roman artifact in an undisturbed Aztec grave creates an impossible paradox. In 1995, the head was subjected to thermoluminescence testing at the Forschungsstelle Archaeometrie of the Max Planck Institute for Nuclear Physics in Heidelberg, Germany. This technique measures the accumulated radiation in fired clay to determine when it was last heated. The results yield an age of 1,780 plus or minus 400 years before present, which corresponds to a manufacturing date range of approximately 230 BC to 570 CE at one standard deviation. This range aligns with the Roman period. The broad margin is typical for TL dating, which is better at ruling out recent manufacture than pinpointing exact ages. The test effectively ruled out the possibility that the head was a colonial-era fake that had somehow been introduced into the burial after 1519. So how did it get there? Romeo H. Hristoff, an archaeologist at the University of New Mexico, who has championed the significance of this find, proposes that the head may be evidence of accidental transoceanic contact. Roman, Phoenician or Berber ships are known to have reached the Canary Islands, and it is not impossible that a vessel could have been blown off course and carried by currents to the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico. Survivors might have traded trinkets with indigenous peoples, and those trinkets could have travelled through established trade networks over many centuries before finally ending up in a grave in central Mexico more than 1,000 years after their manufacture. Others are less convinced. Paul Schmidt, an archaeologist at UNAM, has claimed that the head was planted as a practical joke by a participating archaeologist named Hugo Modano, who allegedly never had the heart to tell Garcia Payon it was a hoax. However, this claim is based on hearsay and has never been substantiated by documentary evidence. The fact that the burial was sealed beneath 3 undisturbed floors makes it extremely difficult to explain how the object could have been introduced without detection. The Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca head remains one of the most controversial artifacts in Mesoamerican archaeology. If authentic, it suggests that the oceans were highways rather than barriers, and that isolated contacts between the Old and New Worlds occurred long before Columbus. If a hoax, it is an elaborate and remarkably prescient one, planted decades before the technology existed to test its age. Either way, it reminds us that history is far more porous than our neat timelines suggest. The thermoluminescence dating of the Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca head deserves closer scrutiny because it represents the strongest scientific evidence against the hoax hypothesis. Thermoluminescence, TL, dating measures the accumulated radiation in crystalline materials, particularly quartz and feldspar, which make up a significant portion of fired clay. When clay is heated during manufacture, the accumulated radiation is released, essentially zeroing the clock. As the object sits in the environment over subsequent centuries, it absorbs new radiation at a relatively constant rate. By measuring the current radiation level and estimating the rate of absorption, scientists can calculate when the object was last fired. The TL tests on the Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca head were conducted in 1995 at the Forschungsstelle Archaeometrie of the Max Planck Institute for Nuclear Physics in Heidelberg, one of the most respected dating laboratories in the world. The results yielded an age of 1,780 plus or minus 400 years before present, corresponding to a manufacturing date range of approximately 230 BC to 570 CE at one standard deviation. This result effectively rules out the possibility that the head is a colonial-era fake. If it had been manufactured after 1519, the TL signature would reflect only 500 years of radiation accumulation, not nearly 2,000. The object is genuinely old. Critics have noted that the date range is broad, spanning over 2,000 years. This is true, but it is a limitation of TL dating in general, not a specific problem with this particular analysis. The technique works best for establishing whether an object is ancient rather than for pinpointing its exact date. What the test confirms is that the Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca head was not made in the modern era. The hoax hypothesis remains possible but requires increasingly elaborate explanations. Hugo Moadano, the alleged prankster, would have needed access to a genuinely ancient Roman artifact. He would have needed to plant it into a burial that had been sealed beneath 3 undisturbed floors. He would have needed to do this without being detected by any of the other archaeologists working on the site, and he would have needed to maintain silence about the joke for decades, even after Garcia Payon took it seriously. None of this is impossible, but it is considerably more complicated than the alternative explanation that the head is a genuine Roman artifact that somehow reached pre-Columbian Mexico. The presence of Romans in the Canary Islands is now archaeologically confirmed. A Roman trading post dated to between the 1st century BCE and the 3rd century CE was discovered on the island of Lanzarote in 1987. Additional research in 2006 confirmed that Punic and Phoenician seafarers had reached the archipelago even earlier, by at least the 4th century BCE. These cultures were clearly capable of Atlantic voyaging. From the Canaries, the prevailing winds and currents flow westward toward the Caribbean. A ship blown off course or deliberately exploring could have reached the American coast. Survivors might have traded trinkets with indigenous peoples. Over centuries, those trinkets could have travelled inland through established trade networks, eventually ending up in a grave in central Mexico. This scenario does not require organised contact or colonization. It requires only a few accidental voyages and the gradual diffusion of a small Roman artifact through Native American trading systems. The head weighs only a few grams. It could have changed hands dozens of times over 1,000 years before finally being selected as a burial offering. We may never be certain, but the TL dating means we cannot simply dismiss the head as a modern fake. It is genuinely old, and its presence in Mexico demands explanation. The Ural nano-structures. I need to begin this section with an important disclaimer. What follows is one of the most controversial entries on this list, and the claims made about these objects have never been verified by the mainstream peer-reviewed science. I present this discovery not as established fact, but as an unresolved mystery that continues to circulate in discussions of anomalous artifacts. Between 1991 and 1993, gold prospectors working along the Narada, Kozhim and Balbanyu rivers in the eastern Ural mountains of Russia reportedly discovered something that defies easy explanation. Mixed into the sediment at depths between 3 and 12 meters, they found tiny metal objects, spirals, coils, shafts, and other components that look disturbingly similar to modern nanotechnology. According to reports, the Russian Academy of Sciences analysed the objects at facilities in Syktyvkar, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. The largest pieces, measuring about 3 centimeters, were found to be made primarily of copper. The smallest, some measuring only fractions of an inch, were reportedly composed of tungsten and molybdenum, rare metals that are extremely difficult to work and have melting points exceeding 3,400 degrees Celsius. When examined under magnification, the spirals reportedly show remarkable regularity. They are precisely wound, with consistent spacing between turns, the kind of uniformity that would be essentially impossible to achieve by hand, even with modern tools. According to the principal researchers, these objects could only have been manufactured with machine-guided technology. And here is where it gets truly strange and truly problematic. The geological analysis of the sediment layers where these objects were reportedly found dates them to the Upper Pleistocene epoch, with some claims ranging from 20,000 to as far back as 318,000 years ago. This is not a minor discrepancy that might be explained by contamination or error. This would place the artifacts deep in the Ice Age, hundreds of thousands of years before any known human civilization, before anatomically modern humans had even migrated out of Africa according to conventional models. Initial speculation that the objects might be debris from the nearby Plesetsk Cosmodrome, a Russian space launch facility, was reportedly investigated. However, the possibility of contamination from Cold War-era industrial activity or other modern sources has never been definitively ruled out by independent investigators. Research largely halted in 1999 with the death of Dr. Johannes Viehbag, one of the principal investigators. Since then, the nanostructures have faded into relative obscurity, occasionally surfacing in discussions of out-of-place artifacts, but never receiving serious mainstream scientific attention. The conventional scientific establishment has largely ignored the find. This may be because the implications are too radical to consider, or it may be because the evidence simply does not withstand rigorous scrutiny. The absence of peer-reviewed publications in mainstream scientific journals is notable. The claims rest primarily on reports from Russian institutions that have not been independently verified, and the chain of custody for these objects remains unclear. I include the Ural nanostructures in this list not because I am convinced they are genuine evidence of prehistoric advanced technology, but because they represent the kind of claim that circulates widely and deserves honest assessment. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence here falls short of that standard. However, the objects reportedly do exist, they have been photographed and analysed, and no one has been able to definitively explain them, whether as genuine anomalies or as contamination or hoax. This is territory where skepticism is warranted, even essential. Approach with caution. The geological context of the Ural nanostructures is crucial to understanding why they are so controversial, and why healthy skepticism is appropriate. The objects were reportedly found in what geologists call alluvial deposits, sediment layers left behind by ancient rivers and streams. The specific horizon where the artifacts were located allegedly corresponds to the Upper Pleistocene, a geological period spanning from approximately 126,000 to 11,700 years ago. Some reports have dated specific layers to as far back as 300,000 years. If the sediment dating is accurate and the objects were genuinely deposited at that time, we face an impossibility. Tungsten and molybdenum are refractory metals with extremely high melting points. They are not materials that would naturally occur in these formations. They require advanced metallurgical technology to process. Tungsten, in particular, was not successfully isolated in pure form until 1783 and was not used industrially until the early 20th century. However, there are significant problems with accepting this narrative at face value. First, the dating methodology has not been independently verified. We have reports of geological analysis, but the original data has not been subjected to peer review in mainstream scientific journals. Dating alluvial deposits is notoriously complex, and objects can migrate through sediment layers over time. Second, the region is not pristine. The Ural Mountains have been sites of industrial activity for centuries, and the area has been affected by Soviet-era military and space programs. The Plesetsk Cosmodrome is not far away. While reports claim that debris from the facility was ruled out, contamination from other sources, mining operations, industrial waste, or even deliberate planting cannot be excluded without rigorous investigation that has never occurred. Third, the research effectively ended with Dr. Feebag's death in 1999. No major scientific institution has taken up the investigation since then. The objects remain in Russian collections, occasionally photographed and discussed, but never subjected to the kind of rigorous peer-reviewed analysis that might settle the matter definitively. Some would say this silence is evidence that the scientific community knows the objects are not what they appear to be. Others would say it reflects the reluctance of mainstream academia to engage with fringe claims that lack solid evidentiary foundation. The most parsimonious explanation may simply be that without compelling evidence, there is no incentive for researchers to invest time and resources in investigation. I present this section because the Ural nanostructures are frequently cited in discussions of anomalous artifacts, and I believe audiences deserve an honest assessment of the evidence, including its limitations. The objects may be exactly what some claim, evidence of technology from impossible times, or they may be contamination, misidentification, or hoax. Without further investigation, we simply cannot know. Great Zimbabwe. In the southeastern highlands of Africa, surrounded by the modern nation that now bears its name, stand the ruins of a medieval city that Europeans refuse to believe could have been built by Africans. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a wealthy trading empire that flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries CE. At its peak, the city housed a population estimated between 10 and 20,000 people. The preserved stone ruins cover approximately 7.22 square kilometres, though the original urban area may have been larger. Its most impressive feature is the Great Enclosure, an elliptical wall more than 250 metres in circumference and over 11 metres high at its tallest point. The wall contains carefully fitted granite blocks, assembled entirely without mortar. Rising within this enclosure is the conical tower, a solid stone monument approximately 9 to 10 metres tall and 5 metres in diameter. Its purpose remains unknown. Some researchers suggest it may have been a symbolic grain bin, representing the wealth and generosity of the rulers. Others propose it might have had religious or astronomical significance. The tower is completely solid, containing no chambers or passages. When Portuguese explorers encountered rumours of Great Zimbabwe in the 16th century, they assumed it must have been built by some vanished biblical civilization, perhaps the legendary mines of King Solomon or the palace of the Queen of Sheba. When European archaeologists began excavating the site in the late 19th century, they stubbornly insisted that indigenous Africans could not have been responsible for such sophisticated construction. Phoenicians, Arabs, ancient Egyptians, anyone but the Shona people who actually lived in the region. This willful blindness persisted for decades despite clear evidence to the contrary. In 1905, British archaeologist David Randall McIver visited the site and recognised immediately that the material culture was African, not foreign. The pottery styles, the construction techniques, the organisation of the settlement, everything pointed to indigenous origin. He published his findings, stating unequivocally that there was no evidence of non-African construction. In 1929, Gertrude Caton Thompson conducted even more rigorous excavations and confirmed Randall McIver's conclusions. Her work was thorough, methodical, and scientifically sound. She found no evidence whatsoever of foreign influence and stated publicly that the site was of Bantu origin from the medieval period. Yet the white government of Rhodesia actively suppressed these archaeological findings that attributed the ruins to local African builders. Scientists who published evidence of indigenous construction were forced out of the country. Peter Garlake, one of the most important scholars of Great Zimbabwe in the 20th century, was among those expelled. Guidebooks, museum displays, and school textbooks were censored. The political implications of acknowledging that Africans had built a civilization rivaling medieval European cities were simply too threatening to the colonial narrative. Today, the evidence is overwhelming. Radiocarbon dating, pottery analysis, architectural styles, and oral traditions all confirm that Great Zimbabwe was built by ancestors of the Shona people, a Bantu-speaking group who migrated to the region around the 2nd century CE. The construction techniques evolved from earlier traditions of stone building in the region. The decorative soapstone birds found at the site are consistent with Shona religious practices. The economy of Great Zimbabwe was based on cattle herding, agriculture, and long-distance trade. Gold from nearby deposits was exchanged for goods from across the Indian Ocean. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain, Persian glass beads, and Arab coins at the site, demonstrating connections to trading networks stretching from Asia to East Africa. And yet mysteries remain. Why was the city abandoned around 1450 CE? The most likely explanation is environmental degradation, deforestation, overgrazing, and exhaustion of resources. A population of up to 20,000 people required enormous quantities of wood for fuel and construction. The surrounding landscape may simply have been unable to sustain such concentrated habitation, but we cannot be certain. Great Zimbabwe reminds us that the biases of those who study history can distort our understanding for generations. The city was always there, the evidence was always clear, but it took nearly a century for the truth to overcome prejudice. The systematic suppression of archaeological truth at Great Zimbabwe represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of the discipline. When David Randall McIver published his findings in 1905, stating that Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous Africans, the colonial establishment was outraged. His conclusions threatened the ideological foundation of white rule, which rested on the premise that Africans were incapable of creating civilization without outside assistance. If Great Zimbabwe had been built by ancestors of the people currently living under colonial domination, the entire moral justification for that domination collapsed. When Gertrude Caton Thompson confirmed Randall McIver's conclusions in 1929, the reaction was even more hostile. She was attacked in the press and in academic circles. Her findings were dismissed, misrepresented, and ignored. The government of southern Rhodesia actively promoted alternative theories attributing the ruins to Phoenicians, Arabs, or other foreign builders. This suppression continued for decades. Peter Garlake, one of the most important scholars of Great Zimbabwe in the 20th century, was forced to leave Rhodesia because of his work demonstrating indigenous construction. Museum displays were censored. School textbooks presented discredited theories as fact. Tour guides were instructed to avoid mentioning African builders. The political stakes were explicit. When African nationalist movements pointed to Great Zimbabwe as evidence of pre-colonial achievement, the white government responded by doubling down on denial. The ruins became a battlefield in the struggle over who had the right to rule. This history matters because it demonstrates how easily archaeological truth can be distorted by political power. The evidence for African construction was always clear. The scientific consensus was established by 1905. Yet for 80 more years, colonial regimes succeeded in suppressing that consensus through institutional control, censorship, and intimidation. Today, Great Zimbabwe is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a national symbol of the country that took its name from the ruins. But the damage done by decades of misdirection has not been fully repaired. Many people around the world still believe, based on discredited theories they encountered in old books or on the internet, that the site must have been built by outsiders. The lesson is sobering. Archaeological knowledge is never purely objective. It is always mediated by the cultures and power structures that fund, publicize, and interpret research. What we think we know about the past is shaped as much by politics as by evidence. The Marcahuasi Plateau, 4,000 meters above sea level in the central Andes of Peru, about 60 kilometers east of Lima, sits a volcanic plateau covered with enormous granite formations that seem to depict human faces, animals, and mythological figures. The Marcahuasi Plateau covers approximately 4 square kilometers. Its formations bear names like the Monument to Humanity, the African Queen, the Egyptian Princess, and even a figure that some believe resembles the Egyptian goddess Taweret. Depending on the angle of viewing and the position of the sun, these massive rocks appear to transform, revealing different faces at different times of day and year. The site first received serious archaeological attention in 1922, when Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello investigated the pre-Columbian remains on the plateau. But the man most responsible for bringing Marcahuasi to international attention was Daniel Russo, a Peruvian explorer who began studying the plateau in 1952 and spent years documenting its formations. Russo believed that the formations were not natural at all, but were carved by an ancient civilization he called the Masma, a global culture that supposedly predated all known history. He documented hundreds of what he considered sculptures, claiming they represented every race of humanity and animals, from continents that the ancient Peruvians should not have known existed. The mainstream archaeological view is less romantic. Most scientists attribute the formations to erosion. The granite of Marcahuasi, formed from volcanic activity millions of years ago, naturally weathers into rounded, organic shapes. The human mind, evolved to recognize faces and patterns, interprets these random forms as intentional sculptures. This phenomenon, known as pareidolia, explains why we see faces in clouds, rabbits on the moon, and figures in ancient rocks. And yet, there are small pre-Columbian structures on the plateau, primarily chulpas or funerary tombs, indicating that ancient people did use the site. Mummified remains have been found and can be seen in the museum at nearby San Pedro de Casta. The presence of these genuine archaeological features raises the question of why ancient people chose this particular spot for their burials. Did they see the same faces in the rocks that modern visitors see? Did they believe they were burying their dead in the presence of the gods? Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University who is known for his controversial work on the age of the Sphinx, has visited Marcahuasi and offered a nuanced interpretation. He suggests that while the formations are probably natural in origin, they may have been recognized as sacred by ancient peoples precisely because of their resemblance to spiritual figures. The plateau may have been a place of pilgrimage and ritual where the landscape itself was perceived as alive with divine presence. Marcahuasi occupies an uncomfortable space between geology and mythology. The scientific explanation that these are eroded rocks and nothing more is almost certainly correct. But it fails to capture why the place feels so powerfully strange, why visitors report visions, healing experiences, and encounters with entities they cannot explain. Perhaps the ancient Peruvians understood something we have forgotten. Perhaps the landscape was never just rock to them. Perhaps they lived in a world where the boundary between stone and spirit was far more permeable than we allow ourselves to imagine. The geological explanation for the Marcahuasi formations is straightforward, but may not capture the full significance of the site. Granodiorite, the rock type that dominates the plateau, weathers in characteristic ways. Chemical breakdown along crystal boundaries creates rounded surfaces. Wind erosion smooths edges and accentuates certain features while removing others. Over thousands of years, These processes produce shapes that can resemble faces, animals, and other recognizable forms, especially when viewed from specific angles under specific lighting conditions. This is pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to perceive meaningful patterns in random stimuli. We see faces in clouds, rabbits on the moon, and religious figures in toast. It is a fundamental feature of human cognition, deeply embedded in our neural architecture. We are pattern-seeking creatures, and we find patterns even where none exist. From this perspective, the Marcahuasi formations are interesting geological features that the human imagination interprets as sculptures. The various faces and figures that visitors report seeing are projections of our pattern-seeking minds onto random shapes. There is nothing supernatural, nothing ancient, and nothing mysterious about them. And yet, the pre-Columbian presence at Marcahuasi is undeniable. The chulpes, the funerary structures, the mummified remains found at the site, these are not imagination. Ancient people chose to use this specific plateau for sacred purposes. They carried their dead up to 4,000 meters elevation and buried them among the rocks. Why there? The conventional explanation would be that the plateau offered practical advantages: defensibility, visibility, proximity to resources. But high-altitude plateaus with similar features exist throughout the Andes. The indigenous peoples of Peru had countless options for burial sites. They specifically chose Marcahuasi. Robert Schoch has proposed an intriguing middle position. The formations are natural, he suggests, but they were recognized as significant by ancient peoples precisely because of their resemblance to sacred figures. The pareidolia that we experience today would have been even more powerful for cultures that lived in an animistic universe where spirits inhabited the landscape. The rocks may have been seen as manifestations of divine presence, natural temples created by the gods themselves. If this interpretation is correct, then the distinction between natural and artificial becomes less meaningful. The formations were not carved by human hands, but they were recognized, named, and incorporated into religious practice. They were made sacred by human attention. The plateau became a place of power not because of what was built there, but because of what was perceived there. This shifts the question from whether the formations are carved to whether the ancient Peruvians saw what we see when they looked at them. And if they did, what did it mean to them? What rituals did they perform among these stone faces? What stories did they tell? We will probably never know, but the presence of the burials suggests that the answer mattered deeply to someone. The Enigmalith. In 1998, an electrical engineer named John J. Williams claimed he was hiking in a remote rural area of North America when he noticed something unusual protruding from the ground. It appeared to be an electrical connector. He dug deeper and discovered a small rock with a three-pronged plug embedded seamlessly into its surface. The object has come to be known as the Enigmalith or Petrodox. It presents the undeniable appearance of an electronic component fused into solid granite, a stone composed of quartz, feldspar, and traces of mica. The plug is approximately 8 millimeters in diameter. The three pins are about 3 millimeters high, spaced 2.5 millimeters apart, with a thickness of about 1 millimeter. It looks almost exactly like a modern XLR connector. Williams has stated that he consulted geologists and engineers who examined the object. According to his account, the electronic component shows no trace of having been glued or welded. The matrix material surrounding it is indistinguishable from the surrounding rock. There are no seams, no adhesives, no obvious signs of modern manufacture. The component appears to have been present at the time the rock itself was formed. And that is where things become impossible, or reveal themselves as likely fabrication. Granite forms from the slow crystallization of magma deep within the Earth's crust. The process takes millions of years. If the component was truly embedded during the rock's formation, it would predate humanity by geological epochs. Williams has refused to reveal the exact location of his discovery, claiming he fears the site might be looted of other potential artifacts. This secrecy has understandably led skeptics to conclude that the entire thing is a hoax. Williams has also refused to allow the object to be broken open for internal analysis, though he has reportedly permitted X-rays, which reveal an opaque internal structure at the center of the stone. He has stated he would be willing to sell the object for $500,000, which many see as evidence of profit motive rather than genuine scientific curiosity. So far, few serious researchers have taken him up on offers to examine the object. The scientific establishment has largely ignored the Enigmalith, which is perhaps the most rational response. The claims are extraordinary, the evidence is singular and cannot be independently verified. The secrecy surrounding the discovery location raises legitimate concerns about fabrication. Every principle of scientific caution argues against taking the object seriously. I want to be very clear about my assessment here. The Enigmalith is essentially unverifiable. It may be exactly what Willy Ypres claims, or it may be an elaborate hoax designed to attract attention and eventually generate profit from sale or exhibition. Without independent scientific analysis, which Williams has effectively prevented by refusing destructive testing and location disclosure, we cannot determine which. I include this artifact on the list not because I believe it is genuine, but because it represents a certain type of anomalous claim that circulates in popular culture and deserves honest evaluation. The Enigmalith fails the most basic tests of credibility. It has a single uncorroborated source, it cannot be independently verified, and the discoverer's behaviour, secrecy, refusal of testing, high asking price, is more consistent with hoax than the genuine discovery. The Enigmalith sits in a private collection, waiting. And because Williams will not allow comprehensive testing, it may remain exactly what it is today, an unanswered question, or an answered one that we are simply reluctant to accept. The Enigmalith represents the most frustrating kind of anomaly, an object that cannot be properly investigated due to the restrictions placed on it by its owner. John J. Williams has stated repeatedly that he is willing to allow scientific analysis of the artifact under certain conditions. He must be present during any examination. The rock must not be damaged. He will not pay for the research. These conditions might seem reasonable in the abstract, but they effectively preclude the kind of destructive testing that would definitively resolve the object's authenticity. The most informative tests would require cutting the rock open. Cross-sectional analysis would reveal whether the component is truly fused with the surrounding granite or merely embedded in a cavity. Microscopic examination of the interface between the plug and the stone would show whether there are signs of adhesive, moulding compound, or other binding agents. Chemical analysis of the matrix material might identify organic compounds from modern manufacturing processes. Without these tests, we are left with surface observations and X-rays. The X-rays reportedly show an opaque internal structure, which is consistent with a genuine embedded object, but also consistent with a cleverly constructed fake. The surface observations show no obvious signs of tampering, but the absence of visible evidence is not the same as proof of authenticity. Williams' refusal to reveal the discovery location adds another layer of difficulty. If the site could be examined, investigators might find additional objects, geological features, or contextual evidence that would support or contradict his account. The fact that he has kept this information secret for over 25 years strongly suggests either deception or, at minimum, a fundamental misunderstanding of how scientific verification works. Consider the pattern of behaviour. Extraordinary claim made by a single individual. No independent witnesses, location undisclosed, destructive testing refused, high asking price attached, no peer-reviewed scientific publication. This is not the profile of a genuine scientific discovery. It is the profile of a hoax or a misidentified object being marketed to believers. The Silurian hypothesis, proposed by scientists in 2018, has been invoked to suggest that if an industrial civilization had existed millions of years ago, almost all traces of it would have vanished by now. Within this framework, objects like the Enigmalith become theoretically possible. But theoretical possibility is not evidence. Many things are theoretically possible that have no evidence of ever having occurred. The burden of proof lies with the claimant, and in the case of the Enigmalith, that burden has not been met. Until and unless Williams allows comprehensive testing, or until the object can be examined after his death, the Enigmalith will remain what it most likely is, either an elaborate hoax or a misidentified natural or artificial object that has been sensationalized beyond its actual significance. 10 discoveries, 10 windows into forgotten worlds. We have travelled from the frozen bogs of Siberia to the highlands of Peru, from the underground cities of Turkey to the bronze pits of China. We have seen wooden gods older than agriculture, plaster faces from the dawn of civilization, and masks that stare with eyes that should not exist. Not all of these mysteries carry equal weight. The Shigir idol, the Ain Ghazal statues, Derinkuyu, Great Zimbabwe, and the Sanxingdui bronzes are well documented and accepted by mainstream archaeology. The Baghdad battery and Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca head remain genuinely controversial. The Ural nanostructures lack the peer-reviewed evidence their extraordinary claims would require, and the Enigmalith is almost certainly not what it claims to be. But even the genuine discoveries teach us something profound. Knowledge is fragile. The Ain Ghazal people developed industrial chemistry 9,000 years ago, and their descendants forgot how to do it. The builders of Derinkuyu carved an 85-metre underground city, and within a generation it was lost. For every artifact preserved by accident, countless others have crumbled into dust. We reconstruct the past from fragments. The Shigir idol survived only because of a chemical accident in a peat bog. By every law of biology, it should have rotted into nothing. How many other miracles are we missing? How many civilizations expressed their greatest achievements in materials that simply melted back into the earth? This is why these discoveries matter. Not because they prove ancient aliens or lost super-civilizations, they do not, but because they remind us how much we do not and cannot know. The neat timeline we learned in school is a construct, a simplified story imposed on fragmentary evidence. The real past was messier, stranger, and more wonderful than any story we tell about it. If you want to go deeper, you can see these artifacts yourself. The Shigir idol is at the Sverdlovsk Regional Museum in Yekaterinburg. The Ain Ghazal statues are at the Jordan Museum, the Louvre, and the Smithsonian. Derinkuyu is open to visitors in Turkey. Great Zimbabwe is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Sanxingdui Museum in Gwanghan displays the bronzes. Stay curious. Question what you are told, including what I have told you tonight. Demand evidence. Think critically. The greatest discoveries are still waiting to be made. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care.